of the Anglican Diocese of Toronto.
Mayor Tory, do you think we could try and get some of the other members of committee back, because you can't even excuse yourself for a minute to go to the bathroom because we're at bare quorum? And I think they're still in the building.
Is that a formal complaint, Councillor Shannon?
That's a formal, that's
I
an
think we
informal
might just
request.
call, maybe my office could help and the clerk's office just to call a couple of people we think are, I think they're mostly still around. Be helpful.
If it was the will of committee, Councillor Perks would volunteer to sit on executive.
Be careful what you wish for, Councillor. Careful. Careful what you wish for. All right. Sorry about that, Reverend. Please, it's your turn.
Thank you. I'm also joined by my colleague, the Reverend Andrea Budgey, the chair of the Poverty Reduction Committee of the Diocese. There's a certain amount of frustration in the process as it's unfolding. I acknowledge, and I'm glad, that there is an opportunity for input much earlier in the budget process this year. Unfortunately, what seems to have preceded any of that is a decision to proceed with an aspiration to hold the budget at zero, and this is being treated as a kind of fait accompli priority, which just arrived out of the back rooms before there was any community consultation or any community input, or indeed input from councillors to a large extent. That's not what I'm primarily here to talk about, but it is a source of some frustration. I do want to say that the intention to hold the budget freeze, and I understand you're saying this may not work out in the eventual budget, but that even that aspiration is an aspiration towards decreasing the overall health of the city, increasing the suffering of our most vulnerable and marginalized residents. We know what the situation is. We know how many people are on the street. We know people are dying. We know how many people are waiting for housing. We know how many children are living in poverty, more than a quarter of the children in Toronto. A budget freeze, or a budget freeze slightly modified by city departments fighting for each other over crumbs at city council, is not going to help. What is going to help is something much greater and much broader. Given that this year's direction seems largely to have been set, what we're asking for this year is, if you cannot see your way to a new vision for 2018, at least please exempt shelter services and housing and TCHC from the budget freeze aspiration. We need that. Those departments are terribly underfunded right now. Shelter occupancy is a nightmare right now. We need to have more resources in those sectors which are serving the most vulnerable and needy of our citizens. I want to acknowledge also that good work has been done here today on affordable housing. I'm really happy with those motions that were passed. That's encouraging. Some good steps are being taken, but we are so far from what we need. And I'd like to turn it over to Andrea now.
Thank you for including me in this. I'm not going to restate what my colleague has said, but distasteful as I find the phrase, I want to point out that a world-class city needs world-class revenue tools. And I'm talking about taxes of all sorts. I'm talking about a property tax which isn't held as a matter of magical thinking to the rate of inflation, because what you really want to be doing when you go to the citizens of the city is asking them to invest in a vision of a city which is generous, compassionate, inclusive, environmentally sustainable, not sort of shamble up to them with the squeamish kind of approach of a first-time panhandler going, could we at least have the rate of inflation? We want people to be motivated by a care for the social fabric, to be looking not just for the hopes of individual prosperity, but to recognize that what we're doing at the moment comes at the cost of terrible human misery. And councillors see it in their wards, social agencies and faith groups see it every day. And it needs to be a project for the whole city to work on. So please bear that in mind in future as a vision to be shared, not as an excuse to be made.
All right, well, thank you both for those comments. And are there questions of these deputies? Councillor Cressy.
Just one question, and thank you for being here. So I heard your first point, which is a budget direction based on a vision for the city as opposed to on cost containment for the city. But in the absence of that, did I hear you correctly that you think at the very least we should exempt Shelter Support and Housing Administration and TCHC from this budget direction?
Yes, absolutely. If we can't change the budget direction, at least please exempt those agencies.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions of the deputies? Councillor Barlow.
You're aware of the work that is going on with Attendance First, that we have a big report in July coming forward with recommendations on funding, on changes, on things that need to be improved. So what you're saying is that we definitely need to fund whatever is coming in July as well, right?
Yes, yes, I know that there is good work being done and that there are going to be recommendations that are going to have costs. If we want to do this work, we should provide the resources to follow through on the recommendations that come forward.
Thank you.
Other questions of the deputies? I just had a couple, if I might. It's frustrating because when we begin this process, you have to sort of start by getting people to examine the spending we're doing now. And I think this is true in every organization, and I've often said in every household. But I just wanted to ask you a question. I mean, in the Anglican Diocese, when you have prepared your budgets, I assume there might have been some point in history, whether it was every year or once in a decade, where somebody said, well, could we start the budget process by sort of saying, let's look at what we spend now and see how we could do if that's all we had to spend. I assume that that's probably been the case. I'm willing to bet money that there have been years where, for a variety of reasons, there wasn't more money to spend or it wasn't easily available, and that you've had to do that as the beginning of the exercise and then make decisions later as to areas that were particularly of high pressure. Would that be the case?
I do not budget for the Diocese of Toronto. I do budget for my parish. Where we start with the parish is there is a role we need to fill in the community, there are needs we need to meet, and the priority is to meet those needs, and whatever we have to do to meet those needs, we will do that. We feed upwards of 500 people every week, sometimes 300, 500. And we start our budgeting from the point of view that this is work we must do, and we need to find the money that we need to continue doing that work.
And could I assume then, because I think that's a fair answer, could I assume that there have been times when in the life of that diocese, of that parish, that in order to do the work you had to do to feed the people, you actually couldn't count on raising the money somewhere, and you had to actually look at another area of expenditure and say, well, because it's so important to feed the people, we have to maybe do something less over here? Is that something that
That's exactly why I'm asking for shelter services and housing in the TCHC to be exempted from a budget freeze.
So if I was to tell you that this year's budget, 2017, and I'm not arguing that we don't still have huge pressures in that area that you've referred to, shelter and housing, if I was to tell you that this year's budget increased by 16.8%,
Yes.
which is 8 times the rate of inflation. So property taxes were limited to inflation, but the budget went up 16.8%, 8 times the rate of inflation. Would you accept that as being a fact?
I accept that as a fact. Would you accept it as a fact that shelter occupancy is over 90% every night of the year, and that we have to get it under that? We should be getting it down to 80%. We've now gone down to just trying to get it to 90%, and we're not even close to that.
And that's including the out of the colds.
I beg pardon?
And that's including the out of the colds, which weren't intended to be part of the system at all.
I really just wanted to make the point that without for a moment arguing that we're sort of there and we can just kind of, sit back and be complacent, that I think this process, for whatever its flaws are, and I think almost anything you did would be subject to criticism, but this process ends up producing a result that tries to allocate the money where it's most needed. So if you look last year, you'd agree with me. I think that we brought about substantial increases for transit and housing and shelter. I'm not arguing it was enough, to resolve any particular issue, but we addressed those disproportionate, if I can call it that, to other areas that got much less.
Two comments to that. One is that you're never going to be able to invest enough to make a real difference as long as you treat inflation-only property tax increases as a law of physics. It's not. You can invest more proportionately in those sectors, but it's not going to be nearly enough unless we look to increasing revenue tools in a serious way. The other comment is that the way the process plays out now, city departments are put into competition with each other. And so people end up, one department ends up angry at shelter services and housing because they got some more money and some other department didn't. And that doesn't create a very healthy atmosphere in the city either. I think the process has turned into this competitive process of everybody fighting for little pieces of bread. And I don't see that as very healthy.
Reverend, I would just say this to you, that these jobs, and like every leadership job, including your own, is about making choices that you sometimes have to make, not because you want to. Because the alternative you're implying would be just to say to everybody, we can have whatever you want.
Yes, you could also choose to increase property taxes more substantially or to try to bring in a municipal income
I'll
tax.
ask you one
Those
final
are
question.
also choices that can be made.
One final question, which is, are you aware of the fact that literally 100% of the voters in the last, I'll say 99 or 97% of the voters voted for a candidate because all of Ms. Chow, Mr. Ford, and myself all ran, all of us, on a platform which we put to the people. And so I don't know whether you think there's any obligation on the part of people who run for public office, but in this case, people who got 97 or 98% of the vote, or 95 across the city, had the same platform. So some days when I feel, and that was meant, by the way, to protect some people who are in houses who would be pushed out of their houses and in the same dire circumstances that you're trying to address. And again, I'm not for a minute saying I'm complacent, but I'm just asking if you're aware of the fact that 90-some-odd% of the voters, who are the ones that make these decisions, actually voted for candidates who said they would keep inflation.
I think that's a gross oversimplification of why people vote for one candidate or another. There are many, many, many reasons people vote for one candidate or another. They voted within the range of choices they had. They voted for people because of other policies, because of other qualifications. There are many reasons people vote for a candidate. You can't take one point of a platform and say this is obviously why people voted for you or Olivia Chow or Rob Ford. There weren't many other choices aside from you guys.
Particularly when the range on that particular subject was so narrow.
What is that? Well, anyway, never mind. Okay. Well, I thank you very much, both of you. If there are no other questions, we'll thank you for your deputation.
Thank you.